When your favorite river is jam-packed with anglers or your local creek is blown out from runoff, what are you supposed to do? You just pack it in, order some wings, and watch YouTube videos of other people fly fishing? Of course not. Instead, you can switch things up and head to the nearest lake or pond. Now, I know fishing a lake can feel daunting. Do you need a different rod, different flies, a float tube, a sinking line? And when you get to the lake, where in the heck do you find those fish? Well, I promise those questions have fairly simple answers, and you can be successful on lakes with the same gear that you use on rivers. This week on Untangled, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know so you can approach lakes with confidence. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. I have officially run out of ideas for the show, which is why we are doing an episode on lake fishing today. So make sure you buy yourself a lawn chair. That is a critical piece of equipment because you are going to need to get comfortable sitting back and doing a whole lot of nothing, because that's what lake fishing is. It is just sitting there, not doing anything, and hoping that a fish swims into your fly with its mouth open. Okay, I'm kidding, of course. It's actually quite a bit of fun, and lake fishing, I promise, it's nowhere near as overwhelming or as daunting as it may seem, especially if you started your fly fishing journey in rivers. There's going to be more crossover than you would expect. But before we get into lakes, I just want to give y'all a heads up, on the Q&A section for the show this week. We had a listener, he sent in a wonderful question about fishing dry flies to fish that are eating in a consistent, nice rhythm, but you can't actually see the fish at all. You can only see the rise. So we're going to go over some tips for that exact situation, how to tackle that kind of more technical dry fly fishing later on in the show. So make sure you stick around for that. But we are going to start with, like we always do, our main topic, and that is, of course, lake fishing. Now, I'm going to approach this topic today like we've never hit up a lake before. So we're all starting from scratch. And we are going to start out first with my favorite, the gear. You might think it would be the lunch, but usually I don't need a whole ton of lunch when I'm out fishing. It takes away from the time. Now, Alex will probably dispute that. But I really don't eat when I'm home and I'm working. That's when I eat myself. I've got a spread. But when I'm out on the lake or out on the river, I don't eat too much. But anyways, unless you are fishing somewhere with enormous fish, think like Pyramid Lake in Nevada with its 20-pound cutthroat trout. The same 9-foot 5-weight fly rod that you're using on rivers is going to work just fine on a lake. Now, longer rods like 10-foot 6-weights or 10-foot 5-weights, they're awesome. They can make lake fishing really fun because you got a little bit more reach. You can roll cast a little bit easier with them. They're just a little bit more of an effective tool for lake fishing, but they are not absolutely necessary. So you don't need to go out and buy one of those rods to be successful on a lake. Your regular old 9-foot 5-weight is going to take care of you just fine. And that goes for your floating fly line, your weight forward 5-weight floating fly line, your 4 and 5X leader and tippet, your indicators, and then a lot of the flies that you use for rivers, we're going to go ahead and use on lakes as well, because there's a lot of crossover between the aquatic insects in lakes and rivers. There's a few differences, but there is a ton of crossover between the two. And we will get into fly selection in more detail here in a minute. For now, big thing to remember with gear, your 9-foot 5-weight rod and reel that you use on the river, take that to the lake. You're going to be just fine. Now, there is one thing that I need to address here as well, because I'm sure we'll get some comments on it, and that is using a float tube. For those who may not know, a float tube is literally just like one of those inner tubes that you float down a river in, but it's been fancified for fly fishing. They're a little bit nicer than that. They're a little bit easier to get in and out of, but the concept is the same. It's a tube you float in, and you get out onto the lake. They can be really great for positioning yourself out on the lake, getting away from the bank, giving yourself more casting room. But you've got to haul them to the lake. You got to pump them up. You got to wear flippers to propel yourself around. So they are a little bit more work. And whether it's worth it is completely up to you. The key to remember is whether you're fishing from a float tube or you're fishing from shore, the concepts that we're going to talk about today are all the same. So bear that in mind, and don't feel like you've got to go ahead and go buy yourself a float tube either. I'm going to be walking you guys through this as if you're fishing it from shore, because that's how I do most of my lake fishing. I used to float tube quite a bit, actually, and then I got fat, and it's not comfortable anymore. So if I ever lose the weight, I might go back to float tubing. It is a lot of fun, but you can be just as, well, I shouldn't say just as effective, because sometimes there are some lakes where you really do need a float tube to absolutely kill it. But most lakes, you can be plenty effective from shore, catch plenty of fish.
Hey there, it's Alex. You ever find yourself standing in the river, staring at your open fly box, wondering, what the heck do I tie on? Yeah, it happens to all of us, especially if you're not quite sure what bugs are active. That's why we've put together our year-round hatch chart. It breaks down the major hatches that happen across the US so you can understand what's happening in your neck of the woods and pick the right fly with confidence. Snag a free copy by scanning the QR code on the screen or hit the link in the show notes. All right, back to Untangled.
We've got our gear. We've talked about our float tubes. We're going to pull up to the lake. We're ready to go. The first and I think biggest problem that you have to solve here is where in the heck are those fish? Because in rivers, we know that we need to look for seams and riffles and runs and pools and pockets. All the places that fish love to hang out. But you pull up to a lake and it's just a giant pool. There is absolutely no structure. Do you just start blindly casting and hoping for the best? Like, you know, that really desperate guy that just hands out his number to every girl at the mall, just hoping that someone will call him back? Or do you pull out that lawn chair, like I said from earlier, take a load off and just cross your fingers and hope that a fish swims into your fly? Now, those both, you could do both, and you could probably catch fish both ways, but you can actually read a lake in a very similar fashion of the way that we read rivers. So the first thing to look for is the most obvious, and that's going to be rising fish. So if you pull up to the lake and there's fish rising, the hardest part of lake fishing, in my opinion, is finding where the fish are. So if you find those fish, they're rising, the hardest part of your job is over. You string up a dry fly, you get over those fish, you have yourself a day. You go catch them and enjoy yourself. Now, if you pull up to the lake and the fish aren't rising, which is, I don't know, I feel like most often the case, unless you're there real early in the morning or at dusk when they're very active, that's when you're going to want to look for two main things. You're going to want to look for transition points and structure. A transition point can be any area in the lake where the water depth changes very suddenly. If it goes from shallow to deep, or there's a really big bunch of boulders and rocks submerged, and then nothing in a big sandy, gravelly patch. Okay. Any sort of transition point is going to be a good place to target. And then along those same lines, you're also going to look for structure. Now, structure can be anything from a weed bed where there's breaks in the weed beds that the fish will hang out in, to submerged rocks, to logs and fallen trees that have ended up in the water. The fish like that structure. They feel a little safe around it. Gives them a place to hide from overhead predators. They don't really have to worry about the osprey as much. And fish just enjoy hanging out around structure. That's something we know about them in rivers. They're going to do the same thing in a lake. So if you can find a transition point or you can find structure, those are the places that I would start fishing to first. And again, those transition points, sometimes they can be kind of tough to locate because the lake may be really shallow. We'll go back to Pyramid for a minute. The Pyramid Lake, the reason a lot of folks, if you've seen people fishing it, they stand from ladders and fish it because the first, 20, 30 feet off the shore, it isn't that deep. It's like 5 or 6 feet deep, maybe a little bit deeper in some spots. but then there's a big drop off out there. Now, you usually can't cast all the way to the drop off. So you get in your ladder so you can make a cast all the way to that drop off and get your flies right on that transition point where the fish are just cruising. So sometimes those transition points might be a little bit harder to locate. So if you can get, above the lake a little bit and look for that, that can be a helpful way to identify where you get some deep to shallow transitions. But usually they're not too hard to locate. Now, once you find your structure or your transition point, it is time to set up your rig. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. I like to keep my rig very simple. I really don't mess around with too much in the way of sinking lines or sink tip lines, unless I'm just chucking streamers in an ice off situation where the fish are cruising the shallows. They're actively looking to ambush prey like that. I usually won't worry with sink tip or full sink lines. All these other rigs, the full sink lines, the poly leaders, the 20-foot leader setups, they can all be very effective. But to me, those almost feel like the next step that you take in rigging up for lakes once you start to dial in lake fishing and maybe the local lake that you like to fish. These are the things that you add on to the base setup, which is my go-to rig. And if the fish aren't rising, go-to rig is just a double nymph rig under an indicator. I'll put a 9-foot leader on the end of my floating line, and I'll make sure that leader is sized appropriately to my flies. And then I'll usually tie on another couple feet of tippet just to the end of that leader. So I'll end up with about an 11-foot leader, and that's where I'll tie my first nymph on. And then I just use the clinch knot on that nymph, and then another 15 to 20 inches off the bend of that hook, again with a clinch knot. And then I'll tie my second nymph off of that piece of tippet off the bend of the hook. And boom, my rig is set up. Now, another rig you can try is stripping a streamer, or you can strip a smaller leech pattern as well. Or you can even strip scuds, because scuds will kind of move in this like inchworm style movement in the water. And you can do all of this very effectively with a floating line. I've caught a lot of fish on streamers fished with a floating line. You don't need a sink tip. You don't need a full sink line in a lot of situations. Sometimes you do, but in a lot of lake fishing situations, they're not absolutely necessary. Because you can use a heavy fly to sink it, or you can get some split shot to get those flies down deep enough. You generally want those flies just ticking a little bit above the bottom. So a sink tip can be effective. It can just make the whole casting process easier, but it's not absolutely necessary. Now, if you do opt to set up a streamer or a leech or strip some scuds in by hand, I recommend using, for streamers and leeches, I recommend using a shorter leader, around 5 feet long. They're a lot easier to cast. And then again, you'd be running these around the structure, around the drop off. So generally you don't need to get too deep because you're just kind of fishing the edges of the lake. Okay. So that's how you could rig up with your streamers and nymphs. Let's go back to that nymph rig that I talked about. The rig, very simple, but what flies do you use? How do you know which ones to pick? What are the fish going to be eating? Well, it's actually pretty simple, because a lot of the same flies that the fish are eating in rivers, they're going to eat in the lakes as well. Mayflies and midges are very abundant in lakes, but the most abundant food sources tend to be your midges, your scuds, and your leeches. And I'll get a little specific here, and I'll give you some of the flies that I use myself. In lakes, midges can grow pretty large. When they get to this larger size, we call them chironomids. And I like chironomids in about sizes 10 to 14. I've got some of those in my box at all times. I'll have them in red, black, brown, and I'll just do the ice cream cone variant. It seems to be very effective, works very well for me. I also keep a good selection of scuds for lake fishing, because scuds are the buffalo wings of the lake. Okay, they come in a bunch of different varieties, so you can find one that suits the taste of any trout, no matter how delicate its palate might be. They're nutritious. Everyone loves them, and they're extremely filling. I don't know what more you could want out of food, and that's kind of what scuds do for trout in lakes. So if you carry a few different colors of scuds in sizes 14 to 18, you're going to be set. Rare that you're going to need something outside of that size range, especially if you're up in these high country lakes and ponds, up in the Rockies or wherever you might happen to be. The pattern itself of the scud doesn't really matter. I know there's a lot of different scud patterns, but they're all generally the same. So color and size matter the most. So I would focus on a wide range of colors, a wide range of sizes. Don't worry if it's this special pattern or not, because I don't think that actually matters too much. A scud's a scud. All right. I'd also keep a good selection of leeches on hand. Woolly buggers in sizes 6 to 10 are great to imitate leeches. Get a good variety of colors. Black, brown, olive, and white tend to be my go-to. I don't really stray outside of that too much. I know a lot of folks love purple. A lot of folks mix and match their colors. And it works for them. It really kind of comes down to what you like and what you think the fish like more than anything else. The fish will tell you if they like them or not. And then you also might hear about balanced leeches. That's another fly pattern that gets a lot of love in stillwater, and for good reason. They're a very effective fly. They're very similar to woolly buggers, but they're tied in a way so that they sit horizontal in the water, just like a real leech would. They're not tilted a little bit like woolly buggers and other streamer patterns tend to be, especially when you're stripping them in. These balanced leeches tend to have a little bit more of a jig-like action to them, almost, but then they settle back down to horizontal in the water, which is very effective. And then finally, especially, it's July, especially this time of year, keep some terrestrials in your box for lake fishing. Ants, beetles, and even hoppers can get blown into the water, especially, again, in those high country lakes. They can end up there, and the fish will definitely rise for terrestrials if they're available to them. The same sizes that you fish on rivers, so like 8 to 12 for each of these, except for the ants, which you usually fish in like 14s and 16s, are going to work just fine. Now, if you're ever at a loss as for what fly to use, one little tip you can do is you can wade into the lake for a minute, because if there's any scuds in the lake, they're going to swarm all around your legs. You might get a leech or two, but that's all right. A little leech never hurt anybody. You can also turn over rocks in the lake to get a good idea of what nymphs might be crawling around under there. But again, my go-to rig, like I mentioned, is that double nymph rig. And then what I'll usually do, unless I find different, is a chironomid up top and then with a leech on the bottom of that double nymph rig. And those two really seem to work well. If I'm not getting any love on either of them, I'll switch out the micro leech for a scud, or I'll switch out the chironomid for a scud, or I'll change the depth. Usually you're looking to get those flies down a little bit lower, right suspended up above the bottom, wherever the fish seem to be cruising. That just works very well for me when I go into a lake with that setup. Now, as far as actually fishing that setup goes, I usually like to just cast it, and then I will let it sit for a few minutes. I will let those nymphs bob in the water. They get this natural action to them that makes them look a little bit lifelike. If I've done that for a while and I'm not getting any love, that's when I'll start to give my flies a little bit of action. So I'll strip a little bit of fly line in. We're talking an inch or two at a time, just enough to move those flies, bounce them a little bit, and then I'll let them settle again. Give them 30 seconds or a minute, and then I'll do it again. And sometimes that little bit of action is just what the fish want, and that'll kind of key them in on it, because those bugs are moving underwater. They don't always just sit still, but when you let your nymph rig sit still, they are going to bob. The wind is going to move your fly line a little bit. Some of the current in the lake is going to move your line. So it's going to drag those flies. They're going to have some movement, even if you're not doing anything to it. But sometimes you got to give them just a little bit more movement to get those fish to commit. Now, when that indicator goes underwater, when a fish eats it, do yourself a favor and wait just a half second. Wait for that indicator to go all the way under, because I can't tell you how many fish I have lost because I set the hook way too early on a lake bite, because they'll come up, they'll grab it, and they'll usually swim with it for a second, and that indicator needs to go under before you set the hook. Otherwise, you're more than likely going to pull that fly right out of their mouth. So don't be super quick on the draw. Make sure you give them time to get it in their mouth. And then the hook set, same thing as if you're on a river. You're going to hold the line tight, lift with the rod. You're not going to jerk. It's going to be a firm lift. Just put tension on that line, drive that hook point home, and you are going to be in business. Now, the hook set is a little bit different if you're fishing streamers or if you're stripping scuds in, if you're fishing without an indicator and you're still fishing subsurface. The best tip for those hook sets is called a strip set. Okay? And what that means is when you feel a fish eat it, you're going to go ahead and strip the line really hard and really fast. And that is going to drive that hook point home, because if you lift your rod, you're going to pull the fly right out of their mouth. You have to strip the line, and you can strip and use a little bit of side pressure to drive the point home. But if you lift like you're setting on a dry fly or a nymph feed, it's going to pull that streamer or leech or small scud out of their mouth. You have to do a little bit of a strip set. And a little bit of a tip on the retrieve with those as well. If you're fishing streamers or, again, scuds or anything on a little bit of a retrieve where you're stripping the line in, you're not just letting them sit under an indicator, the best way that I've found to have success for that is you've got to vary your retrieve quite a bit. So what I mean by that is you're going to throw your fly out there, and let's say you strip it in with 3 or 4 inches of line at a time, let it sit for a sec, strip again, that same amount. Do that 5 or 6 times, and then change it up a little bit. Go a little bit faster, go a little bit slower, mix in some rod wiggle, or bounce your rod tip a little bit. Do a bunch of different things. Give your fly a bunch of different action. Pay attention to the depth. Change the depth of where you're fishing it. And then once you hook a fish, pay attention to what you were doing, because then you repeat that same retrieve pattern. And that's usually going to do very well for you for the rest of the day, because that's the speed and the depth and the action that the fish are keying in on. And then the last thing that we've got to cover with lakes is casting, because on lakes, there's sometimes not a whole lot of room. And you get to the lake, you wonder, how in the heck am I supposed to get my flies out there? Durrant told me to go fish a lake, but there ain't no casting room. Well, that's when you've got to utilize your roll cast, okay? Because that's going to help you cast without if you don't have any room behind you, okay? You just roll those flies on out there. What I prefer to do, if it's possible, is I wade out into the lake a little bit to give myself casting room, and then I'll actually cast parallel to the shore, because usually there is a drop off not too far off of the shore. There's going to be a transition point, or there's structure not too far off the shore. So instead of trying to bomb my cast way out deep into the middle of the lake where I don't know what structure's out there, I can't see, I just cast parallel with the shore, and I pick my points based on what I can see, based on depth changes, and based on color changes, because the water is going to change color as it goes from shallow to deep. Okay, you'll be able to see the deeper stuff's a lot darker, the shallow stuff's a lot lighter. So if you can find patches of water like that where the color's different, you can aim for that stuff. And then when you're parallel to the shore, all of a sudden you've got plenty of casting room, so you don't have to worry about snagging all the trees behind you. And then finally, if you would like to see all of this information in practice, because I know that was an absolute fire hose of info, but if you want to see all of these tips and a few more of them actually used out on a lake, Alex and I just finished a video of us out fishing a couple of lakes. We walked through everything that I just talked about. We caught a few fish along the way. It was a really fun video to do, and folks have seemed to enjoy it so far. So if you haven't looked at that already, you want to see some of these tips in action, I'll throw a link to that in the show notes or right here on the screen if you are watching the video podcast. And that's going to do it for the open of the show this week, folks. That means it is time for the Q&A section. Now, every week here on Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, please go ahead and send those questions into us. The show really does run on your questions, okay? There is a link to do that in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Our first question this week comes to us from John from New Jersey, writes in and says, you see a trout rising, obviously eating flies on top of the water, but you cannot see the fish underwater once the rise is over. After casting your dry fly where you've seen it rise, how far do you let that fly drift if the fish doesn't take it? Do you let it drift like you would a nymph, or do you immediately make another cast? Thank you. You guys have really enhanced my fly fishing experience, and I look forward to all your videos and podcasts. John, thank you. Appreciate the kind words, my friend. I actually just ran into the situation you described yesterday. So it was just wonderful timing on you submitting this question. I was out fishing a section of the local creek that I've never fished before. It's a long ways up in the mountain. It's a little bit of a hike and I'm out of shape. So I just never got around to it, but it's this beautiful meadow looking stretch that I've always thought looked pretty on the map. So I wanted to go check it out. So I got up there and the fish were rising like nuts. They're like meat a buffet, man. They were elbowing each other out of the way to have a chance at snagging some of the mayflies that were hatching. But the fish were just dimpling the surface. There were a couple that launched all the way out, but most of them were just rising, just real subtle rises. Definitely eating duns, definitely eating the adult, but they weren't really being ostentatious about it. And the one riffle I was in, there's probably 20 or 30 fish in that riffle. So I could see those fish rising, obviously, but I couldn't see the fish once they went back underwater because there was the glare on the water, and I was a little bit far back from the fish because I didn't want to get too close and spook them. So this exact situation you described, you see a fish rise, but you can't see them underwater once the rise is over. And I think this is a fairly common situation to run into with dry fly fishing. I think it's rare that you're able to see the fish throughout the entirety of the rise if you're on crystal clear water or you have just the right angle where you can watch the fish come all the way up and eat your fly and go down with it. That's my favorite kind of dry fly fishing to do when I get those opportunities, but I think that's the exception and not the rule like we're talking about here. So the short answer to your question is no, I do not let the fly drift like a nymph, and that's where the long answer to your question comes in. When you get into a good hatch like this, the fish are usually feeding in a little bit of a rhythm. So you've got to take a few minutes and observe these fish. And this is true anytime you go to the water. It pays to watch and wait for a minute. That's a key concept we really try to drill into everybody here at VFC, because you're going to observe a lot more about fish behavior, learn a lot more about fish behavior if you take a minute to watch and wait and observe what's going on before you start making casts. So take a few minutes, observe the feeding pattern of these fish as they are eating the dry flies off the top. Sometimes there's enough food on the water that the fish will rise. It'll sit, let's say it sits for 10 seconds, and then it'll come up, rise again, sit for another 10 seconds, rise again, and it'll just repeat that pattern until the hatch is over. It'll be a very rhythmic, very predictable fish. If the hatch is a little bit weaker, it's not as thick and heavy as the hatches we all dream of, then the fish might just be rising when a bug comes into their feeding lane. So their rises might be further and further apart. Now, the reason this matters is that you want to be able to time your drift of your fly at the moment when the fish is most likely to eat. That's why understanding the timing is really going to play a role here. So what I'll do when I get into a hatch like this is I'll strip out all the line I need to make that cast. And then I will just hold all the line until I see the fish rise. Then I'm going to make my cast far enough ahead of that rise so the fish has time to see it. Because if you cast directly at the rise, you're actually casting behind the fish. Because when a fish rises to eat a dry fly, it doesn't rise straight up. It goes up, but the the current speed up on top of the river pushes the fish back just a little bit because it's moving quicker on top than it is down low. So that pushes the fish back just a little bit. They rise, and then they go back down and they move forward back into their lie where they were hanging out before they rose. So if you cast directly onto the rise, you're actually casting behind where the fish was, and they may not see your fly. So you need to cast ahead of the rise to make sure they see your fly. If the fish is feeding in a longer rhythm, okay, like that 10-second example that I mentioned earlier, you're going to wait for the fish to come up, and then I'd wait for 3 seconds. Say the fish rises, count to 3, and then make your cast, land your fly a few feet ahead, and let it drift right into the lane of that feeding fish, and that usually is going to give you the right kind of timing, okay? Now, if the hatch is sparse and the fish are only rising when the flies are coming into their lane, then the timing doesn't matter as much as just making sure that when you do see a rise, you go ahead and you cast up in front of it. Usually I err for like 2 to 3 feet in front of the fish, let it drift down, give them time to see it. Sometimes you don't need to go that far in front of the fish. It really just depends on how picky they're being, how slow the water's moving, how fast it's moving. There's some factors that go into that. But generally speaking, you want to give the fish a couple of seconds at least to identify, locate, and rise to your fly. So however far ahead you need to cast to give it a few seconds to drift, that's what you should be thinking about. And if that fish doesn't eat it, I will recast, but I'll recast if it's a fish that's feeding rhythmically. I'll wait until the next rise and recast. I don't just pick up and recast immediately because that's a really surefire way to spook the fish and put them down, because all that line buzzing overhead, it tells them that something's going on. So you want to make as few casts as possible to these fish, especially when they're rising rhythmically. You want to time your casts as best as you possibly can. And then definitely let that fly drift. Let it get well downstream of the rise before you pick it up to recast, because you will make some noise, some disturbance when you pick it up to recast. You don't want to spook that fish. So let it get, 10, 15 feet downstream from the fish, and then pick it up and make your next cast. The key point here to end on is that when fish are feeding like this, when they're in this rhythmic feeding of dry flies, it is very rare that they're going to move too far to one side to eat. They might move an inch or two to the left or right, but usually they want that fly right on their dinner plate. Sometimes you can get away with landing it in the kitchen and they'll come over and eat it, but most of the time it has got to be right on their plate. And a good example of this is a couple weeks ago, Alex and I were out fishing and we got into a nice little PMD hatch, and we come around the corner, we see these fish rising, and it's this exact situation. All we see is the rise. We can't see the fish because we were in our boat and we're upstream of the fish. So we can't see them because of the glare on the water and everything, but we can see the rise. So we get into position, anchor the boat to give Alex the best shot at hooking this fish. And this fish was feeding pretty rhythmically. So Alex stripped the line out. He waited for the fish to rise. He made, I think, 1 or 2 false casts. He put that PMD right in the line. It drifted for about a second, and the fish came up and ate it on the first cast. It was just flawlessly executed on the timing, and it ended up being like a 20-ish inch rainbow, just a big, fat, healthy fish. But it only happened because, again, he focused on the timing. He got that fly right in the kitchen, and he made as few casts as possible. So hopefully that answers the questions. If you got any more comments about dry fly fishing, definitely drop those below. I'd love to hear from you guys. And thanks again for sending the question on in. Mark from Pennsylvania has our next question, writes in and says, very new to fly fishing and have been using a Walmart rod and reel for a few weeks. Currently looking to upgrade to a 9-foot 5-weight, but stuck on what to get with so many options. I've been thinking of the Orvis Clearwater combo, but I've heard the reels aren't the greatest. Are there any other combos in a similar price range or separate rod and reels that paired up work great together? Just trying to make sure I'm happy with my choice and covering all the bases before purchasing. Recently started listening, but love the pod, has taught me almost all I know. Mark, I'm sorry, your education's really incomplete then if the pod's taught you all you know. No, thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words. So my 2 cents on this. VFC, we sell the best 9'5" weight rod and reel combo on the market. And that is not just me blowing smoke. I have fished almost every 9'5" weight combo on the market, including the Orvis Clearwater. And I like ours the best. It's a nice medium fast action, which means the rod bends about halfway down the blank. So you can really feel the cast load and unload. You can really learn what good and bad casting feels like. You've got some sensitivity for dry flies, but there's enough backbone to it that you can chuck bigger nymphs and streamers with it if you need to, and you can land big fish. That big rainbow in the story I just mentioned that Alex caught, he caught that on the 9'5" weight fly flinger. So, and it was a 21-ish inch fish, like I said. I've used it during small bluewing hatches, in the early spring, caddis hatches in the summer, stonefly hatches. It's just a good, versatile stick. Now, I know y'all are thinking, well, yeah, Spencer, of course you're going to say that. You work for VFC. You're just trying to make money. Well, yeah, I work for VFC. Of course, I'm going to talk up our products, but I also have spent the last decade of my professional life working in fly fishing media well before I joined the team here at VFC. And I actually cut my teeth doing gear reviews. I've reviewed gear for Field and Stream, for Hatch Magazine, for Midcurrent, for Fly Lords. I've had the opportunity to test probably 6 dozen rods, if not more. I've fished a lot of fly rods. I own over 40 fly rods, which is a real big problem. So I know my way around a fly rod. So when I tell you that I recommend the Fly Flinger highly, that comes from all of that experience. It's not just me blowing smoke. If I didn't think it was a good rod, I wouldn't tell you to go ahead and pick one up. The Fly Flinger isn't perfect. No fly rod is. No matter what anybody says, there's no such thing as a perfect fly rod. But it's a very good little stick, and I would not hesitate to recommend it to anyone. And then the last thing, I don't worry too much about the reel with trout fishing. And I know people get upset when I say this, but the reel, as long as the drag is decent, as long as you've got an okay drag on the reel, and that just means that it actually engages, you can adjust it, and it doesn't have a huge hitch when you're trying to pull line off of it, you're going to be fine. Okay. I've actually used the 8 and 9 weight version of that Clearwater reel you mentioned up in Alaska on salmon. It was a backup reel, was not my first choice, but the other reel got ruined. So I had to go to this one, and it worked great. So, you hear stuff about those reels and think, oh, they're not that great. It's harder now to find a really bad reel, I think, than it is to find one that will work just fine. Unless you're buying a super cheap, like the Walmart combo, those reels are not going to be any good. But unless you're buying something super cheap, all the reels that come with the combos that I've fished, the Orvis one, Reddington's combos, all the other combos, they're all a pretty solid stinking reel. The reel that comes with the Fly Flinger is pretty good. It's handled a lot of 20-inch fish over the last couple of years. It's a little bit wider of a spool, so you get a faster line retrieve because of that. I end up enjoying, or I enjoy it pretty much, or pretty well. So it's a good little reel. Again, the reel does not matter too much, especially for trout fishing. And you can always upgrade the reel later on. But that's my 2 cents on the gear. I could go on all day about it. Maybe I need to in an upcoming show. So, but I'll throw a link to the Fly Flinger in the show notes or up here on the screen, a QR code for those who are watching the show if you're interested in checking it out. But that's a rod I'd recommend, and hopefully that helps clear some things up for you. Appreciate it. Marvin from Missouri has our next question, writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I know you said there isn't such a thing as a stupid question, but to start, would you go over the rod hand grip? For some reason, I have managed to get a blister on the inside of my ring finger. Haven't had this problem before. Not sure what I'm doing differently. I mostly bluegill fish and do a lot of casting. Can a person grip too tight, too loose, or do some twisting in the flinging stage? Does the shape of the cork handle make that much difference? My normal grip is with the thumb on top. Tried the forefinger on top, and that doesn't work for me." Marvin, good to hear from you. And yes, good question. Without me being there to see it in person, it's hard for me to diagnose what's going on with your cast. But if you're getting a blister, there's going to be some friction going on. So that means your rod's probably sliding around in your hand a little bit. That would mean that you're probably gripping it maybe a little too loose, maybe a little too hard. The shape of the cork grip can have an impact on how you hold the rod. But by and large, a lot of the cork grip shapes are very, very similar. And they shouldn't really be causing blisters. So I would tweak your grip on the rod to where the cork's not sliding around too much, because that's what's causing the blister. With what I know about blisters, right? They're caused by friction. So you got to eliminate the friction to eliminate the blister. Now, your question about rod hand grip is good though, because your grip on a fly rod should be firm. You want it secure. Again, you don't want it sliding around everywhere, but you don't want a death grip on it. The only time you need a death grip on the rod is when you've got that 25-inch trout on the end and your heart's racing and you're ready to get it in the net. That's when you really got to hold on for dear life. But other than that, just a nice firm grip, not too tight, not too loose, right in the middle, kind of like a lot of things in fly fishing where it's very subjective, but just want to hold it so you've got a firm grip on the rod. The vast majority of folks I know and fish with, they do grip the rod with their thumb on top of the rod, and that's a very acceptable way to hold your fly rod. But let me tell you a little story about this, because I remember reading an article a while ago. Can't remember what magazine it was in, but I was reading it, and the fella writing it said that he got a lot better accuracy with his dry fly fishing if he put his pointer finger up on top of the rod. Because when he has his thumb on top, he found that he broke his wrist too much. There's too much wrist movement, and he theorized that introduced too much side-to-side movement in his fly rod in the forward cast, which if your fly rod's moving side to side instead of straight, because you want that rod moving on a straight line. If it moves side to side, you're going to lose some accuracy. So he puts his pointer finger on the rod on top of the cork, and that prevents his wrist from breaking as much. And again, according to this feller, that reduces that side-to-side movement called oscillation, side-to-side movement there of the fly rod, and increases your accuracy. So we were out fishing a while ago, Alex and I were, and we got into little blue wing hatches earlier in the spring, and got into a little blue wing hatch. And I could not for the life of me, because there was just enough wind that I was having to work it pretty hard. And I could not for the life of me get my flies to land where they needed to. And I was starting to get really frustrated about it, because some days you just can't cast. And it was one of those days for me. And then I remember that article that I'd read. So I switched my grip. I put my forefinger on top, and it felt funnier than heck, completely unnatural. But I'll be darned if it did not make an enormous difference. And my accuracy shot through the roof. In the first cast with my forefinger on top of the grip, fish on. So there is some, it is worthwhile to look into changing your grip based on different situations. So I found that very interesting that it actually played out the way that the feller writing that magazine article described it. So rod grip can matter. And just remember, again, you want that firm grip, not too hard, not too loose. Just like kind of everything else in fly fishing, needs to be right in the middle. So thanks for that question, Marvin. I appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are done with the Q&A section, but don't go anywhere, because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing stories and pictures from folks who are out there on the water living real life. I love to see what y'all are up to, to see the fish you're catching, the adventures that you're having. So if you've got a live real life moment that you would like to share with us, there is a link to send those in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's live real life moment is from Tyler. I have fished my entire life. When I was about 4, my dad put a rod and reel in my hands and taught me how to fish. I can recall many misty mornings where he and I would go fish, and I felt like an apprentice to a wise master of fishing. He taught me how to catch largemouth, huge smallmouth, walleye, and even redfish, flounder, and speckled trout in the bays of the Gulf. It is because of him that I have this complete obsession with fishing. I'm convinced that I am at my happiest when I am out on the water, especially with the people I love. He taught me how to catch fish, but also to enjoy the sport for the challenge. The time on the water is what I fell in love with. This summer, I had the desire to expand my fishing ability into the amazing world of fly fishing. It took a little bit, but I think I now have the hang of it somewhat. Learning this sport was one of the toughest things to do. I believe a lot of it has to do with not having my wise father to teach me what I was doing wrong like he has my entire life with fishing. I seriously do not think I would be the fisherman or man that I am today without him and everything he has done for me. I finally got to return the favor. I took him, my cousin, and my uncle out for a day on the river. Being able to share this sport with my family is something that I hoped for the second I caught my first fish on a fly, and it had become a reality. Although we had a slow and tough morning, the afternoon bite turned on. I got to teach my dad, who has taught me everything I know, to fish in a brand new way, and he picked it up super fast. I was not surprised in the slightest. When his fly finally got a swirl and his line went tight, I was filled with joy. I was happy that he got him a fish, but I was even happier to have the shared affection for this sport with my dad, who taught me to love fishing in general. I was beyond proud of him and cannot wait to put him on some more trout. Well, Tyler, that's what Live Real Life's all about. That's fantastic, man. Thank you for sending that story in. That is so stinking cool. It's a special relationship with dads and their sons and fishing. And I think a lot of us can relate to that. So thank you for bringing that up to the forefront and reminding us all of it. We really appreciate it. And with that, folks, we're going to end the show this week. Thank you so much for being here. It means more to us than you know. And if you haven't already, please make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live a real life. And that is our entire goal here at VFC. We want you to have the experience that Tyler just had. We want you to have all those great memories out on the water. So speaking of that, go get out on the water this next week. Have some fun. And until I see you next time, live real life.